Welcome back, my friends, to AA Recovery Interviews. I'm your host, Howard L., and I'm an alcoholic. Sober since January 1st, 1988, one day at a time. I'm grateful you've joined us. AA Recovery Interviews is the podcast where Alcoholics Anonymous members from around the world share their extraordinary stories of experience, strength, and hope. There are more than 150 interviews in this podcast series, all of which you can enjoy on aarecoveryinterviews.com and all podcast apps. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll were more than a cliché in the life of Elliott M., my guest on this episode of AA Recovery Interviews. As a prominent rock musician and songwriter for years before his alcoholism drove him into Alcoholics Anonymous, Elliott's drinking ran parallel to his rise to stardom. Ironically, his best songwriting and performances were largely free from the influence of alcohol and drugs. But offstage, his drinking and drugging were decimating every facet of his life. His descent to the bottom occurred during the 5 years preceding his 1985 sobriety date. Like many of his contemporaries, Elliott's career had soared in the midst of his functional alcoholism before booze became the malefactor hell-bent on ruining his life. With his options running out, the answer to his prayer for release finally showed up in the form of a simple AA questionnaire given to him by the woman he would later marry. After his last drink, Elliott's entree into AA launched a new life in which sobriety is his number one priority. His relocation to Paris 35 years ago allowed him to continue active participation in AA and performances for his European fans. In a sober career chock-full of accomplishments, including more than 40 albums, Elliott readily gives credit to his higher power for every step of his success. His ongoing commitment to regular meetings and AA fellowship keep him humbly connected to the program. He readily extends the hand of AA to anyone who reaches out for help. One of my previous guests on AA Recovery Interviews attends meetings with Elliott whenever he's in Paris and suggested Elliott for the show. Meeting him by Zoom has been a real treat, and I think you'll enjoy hearing his captivating story. So please enjoy the next 60 minutes with my friend and AA brother, Elliott M.
Elliott, alcoholic.
Hi, Elliott. Thanks so much for joining me today on AA Recovery Interviews. I really appreciate you taking the time to join me from Europe, more specifically from France.
I'm in Paris, France, in the second arrondissement. Paris is divided into 20 arrondissements, which are the quarters of the city, and they go like spiral out, so the second is right in the center.
Oh, how exciting. I'm always looking for people to share with me the stories that will make the biggest impact on people who hear them around the world. And so I want to really thank you for doing this today. So you don't sound, your French accent is leaving something to be desired. I'm wondering what the heck is up with that?
Mais je peux parler français, si vous voulez.
Oh, okay.
I do speak French, but I've been here 35 years in France. And I'm originally from Long Island, New York, so I probably still have traces of that accent.
You've got that Long Island accent. I was listening to Billy Joel while I was at the gym yesterday, just to kind of reconnect with the 70s there, and the period of music enjoyment that I got locked into. And he's from Long Island too, I believe, isn't he?
He is, and a good friend of mine.
So how did a guy like you end up in AA?
Wow, that's a big question.
It is, I know.
I celebrated an anniversary. I had 39 years of sobriety on May 18th, 1985. Though I don't take much credit for it.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you. But how did I get into AA? It's a miracle, first of all. I'm going to start kind of from that moment. I love that we refer to it as when I came in. It's like when you enter, it's a miracle. When you enter the miracle. And that's what happened to me. If I can go back 39 years, it was early May, and I was in my apartment in New York. And I had to catch a plane the next day to fly out to Milwaukee to do some recording. I'm a musician. I'm a professional singer-songwriter, guitarist. I've been doing it for 50 years. I've always made a living at it. Although it was in my last years of being active, it was pretty tough. But there it was in my apartment. I had to catch this plane the next day, which was Saturday, to do some recording, and it was my first big break I had had in a long time. But there I was, and I'm trying to decide what should I do. I was so nervous about taking this flight the next day and going to Milwaukee, and I said, well, I better go out and have a few beers just to relax. And of course, the next morning, 10 o'clock in the morning, I was back home. I was chugging vodka. I was dropping Valium. I was snorting anything on my shag carpet, which looked like cocaine. And I was praying. And I'd been in this same situation countless numbers of times, right? My heart was going 150 times a minute. And I was just praying to this God of my childhood, really, don't let me die. And I received this message at that moment, very clear. I still remember to this day. It was nothing metaphysical. It wasn't like Bill Wilson's white light moment, but I did receive this message that said to me, Elliott, this is what you do, and you're going to continue doing this. So forget the deals. And I managed to get to sleep. I caught that flight to Milwaukee. I went out to dinner that night with my friend, a fellow musician who I had fired from a band some years before, and he ended up being in a very successful band and brought me out there to record. And I met this woman who I liked, and she drove me home to his house where I was staying. And in her bag, in her purse, she had that questionnaire, are you an alcoholic?
Right.
And she confided in me that she had 2 years of sobriety. And I did not ask her this. She just decided. The look on my face, I guess, her name was Rita. I went through the questionnaire with her, and it was basically yes, 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 yes to every question, except the last question, which was, do you drink in the morning? And I said, no, I do not drink in the morning. And she said, what time do you wake up? And I said, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So she thought I might like to try an AA meeting. I said, it sounds great. I wish I had a problem with alcohol. And she asked me how often I drank. I said, well, every day I drink something. I drink beer or wine, or didn't always get drunk. But she said, we should come to a meeting, and you don't have to say anything or do anything or talk to anybody, but just sit through an hour. And I liked her, and that was really my motivation.
This was in Milwaukee?
This was in Milwaukee in 1985. And, I grew up in the suburbs, and I didn't really like the suburbs. And I'm still a city cat to this day. She brought me to this meeting in the suburbs of Milwaukee, and it was in like a church, and it was in the basement. And
Classic AA.
Classic AA and Midwest, very Midwestern. They close with the Lord's Prayer. And the interesting thing was the person who was leading the meeting said, is there anyone here for their first meeting who wants to say hello? And pointed to me. And I was like, oh, shit, this isn't fair.
They knew it.
And I said, well, I'm Elliott, and I'm checking this out. I don't know what's going on, but I'm here. And everyone applauded. What I didn't realize, there was someone behind me who had actually had their hand up.
Oh, geez.
So I guess I was supposed to claim my seat there. And then they, as they do in Midwest meetings, they broke into small groups, like bridge table size groups. And I sat down at one of those groups, not with Rita, but with a group of strangers, very uncool people. I thought these were insurance salesmen and teachers, and, what am I doing here? I always like to say they didn't know Chuck Berry from Raspberry. And we all went around and did our little share. And when I left that meeting, Howard, I knew these people knew more about me than anyone I'd ever met or talked to. And I virtually just, from that moment on, never had a drink.
So when the day before, when you were drinking, you had no idea that the last drink you took would be the last drink, or that you would end up in AA?
No idea. And in fact, it was the opposite. As I said, I got this message that this is what you do, and I will continue doing it.
That's amazing.
It was, I guess, a first step. I guess that was the moment I admitted I was powerless and I could not stop drinking.
It sounds like an answer to a prayer, Elliott. You mentioned just a few minutes ago that you had asked God to not let you die when you were a child. What was going on that you would have had to utter that kind of prayer as a child?
So I grew up on Long Island in a very upper middle class suburb there, and my father was in show business. and he was kind of a local celebrity. I had a very affluent lifestyle, everything I wanted. Uh, you know,
Mm.
we lived in a huge house with a big wall around it. Neither of my parents drank, by the way.
Hmm.
I mean, my father had a few beers at dinner, but I never saw my parents drunk.
Was there any alcoholism further on back in the family with grandparents?
I heard my mother's father was an alcoholic, and
Hmm.
that really scarred her. He would go off to work and not come back for 2 days later. He'd be on a binge.
Hmm.
When I was 16, Howard, I've always been an insomniac, always a night bird, night owl. And my mother burst into my room. It was about midnight, I guess, and she said, "Come quick, your father's having some kind of an attack." And I went into their bedroom, and there my father was. He was lying in bed, and he was obviously having a heart attack. And at that moment, I didn't know it, but as I watched him, he died. I mean, his eyes turned up.
Hmm.
He lost control of his arms. He made this terrible sound, which is a death rattle sound. It does exist. And I did not know he had died at that point. But my mother sent me next door to get a doctor, and I went to get a doctor. And when that doctor came to the door, he said, "Let me get my bag. I'll be right down." When he ran up to get his bag, I dropped to my knees and I prayed. And I said, "Please don't let my father die." And then we got back to the house, and my mother and I waited outside the room. He went inside for a few minutes, and he came out and he said, "I'm sorry, he's gone." And really, Howard, that was the moment that all my faith just just left me. That was the moment that I lost all belief that things were going to be okay, that things would work out.
Now, you're 16 when this is happening,
Yes.
and so did you have that belief prior to that point? I mean, did you grow up believing that God was working in your life or God worked in the world?
Yes, I did, of course, because I had a good life, and I was provided for. I was a little bit of a nervous kid, maybe, but I had great interest. I was always a reader from a very early age, and I was into music. I started playing the guitar when I was 12, and that instrument and music was really my lifeboat with what happened. So
Mm-hmm.
after my father died, my family went into free fall, really. He had not died at a good time for his business. He had a restaurant by then, quite a big restaurant with local political celebrities. Bobby Kennedy came there, Nelson Rockefeller, people of that era. And we lost everything and moved to a very tiny, ugly little house in the same town. My mother, who had, been to the dancing at the White House,
Mm-hmm.
was then working in a jewelry store in the same building as my father used to have the restaurant. And she hooked up with another guy whose name was Slim, and he was a total alcoholic.
Mm.
Slim was a 3 martini lunch guy. It was the 60s. Slim and I didn't get along at all. I remember watching the Kent State shootings with him, and his response was they should have used machine guns.
Oh, God.
It was the 60s, so I had started drinking almost like all teenagers, 14, 15, and 16. And then I started taking drugs, smoking pot. And when I was 18, I was taking a psychedelic drug called DMT that I smoked. And I had a very bad reaction to that. Started having really bad panic attacks some months later.
Mm-hmm.
I went to see a psychiatrist. He put me on Thorazine for a while. But I continued to drink. Alcohol back in the 60s, it's hard to think of it this way, but that was almost the safe drug. If you just drank, it was okay. There were so many drugs going on.
It wasn't as easy to get as the drugs, though, was it?
Well, the drinking age was 18 back then.
Oh, 18, okay.
It was 18 in New York. And of course, I had a fake ID too, when everybody did.
When you started drinking, were you drinking to fit in with the people around you? Were you drinking for effect? What was the motivation behind your drinking in the first place?
Well, Howard, as I said, neither of my parents really drank. So it wasn't like I was copying them, but it was a peer thing. I mean, you reach a
Yeah.
certain age, and when you go out, you're buying a six pack, and you're trying to get someone to buy it for you in the deli, and you find a place to drink it. I mean, it was just almost the culture of my peers. Everybody was drinking beer and going out and trying to find bars that would serve you.
Did it ease the trauma of losing your dad when you were 16?
I think I just wanted to escape reality in any way I could. I lost all interest in school after that, barely made it out of high school. And, with the drinking and with the drugs, the only thing I really held on to and stayed pretty serious with was my music.
You mentioned a free fall earlier. Why such a free fall after all the success that your dad had? Why did things deteriorate, and how did they deteriorate so quickly in your family?
Well, my father had a very successful outdoor water show in the 50s, and he had Duke Ellington play there and Cab Calloway and famous comedians, and it was an 8,000 seat arena. And then when he stopped that, he opened up a very big, expansive restaurant, a lot of catering, and something happened. It was very successful in the beginning, but then he ran into difficult times. I'm not sure exactly why.
Mm-hmm.
Like any business, there were the ups and the downs, and he passed away when it was at the downside, so we didn't have anything. And my mother, who was totally unprepared to handle all this, she was the daughter of an alcoholic, and I think a lot of her reactions came from that, the fear.
Yeah, how about siblings?
I have a brother and I have a sister. Neither of them are really alcoholics, I would say.
How did they react in that situation?
Well, my sister was 19, so she had already been kind of shepherded through into a college. She was going to university. She came home to finish her schooling near us. I was 16 and my brother was 13. So, and neither of us had anyone telling us we should go to college or anything like that. We were pretty much on our own at that point. My mother was just totally unprepared to handle, my father just dropping out of the scene. He was really the magic man who had kept it together.
That sounds really, really a tragic time in her life, as well as the rest of the family.
It was. She was 36 or so and three kids, huge debts on her head, and I don't know how. I'm amazed she handled it. I have to give her credit kind of for handling it as well as she did.
Yeah. Did you stay on Long Island after you moved out of the big house?
Yeah, we in fact stayed in the same town. Same town. Mm-hmm. I mean, we went from like the biggest house in that town to the smallest house in that town.
What was that like for you, and especially around your peers and people who knew you and knew your father and knew the affluence that you had come from?
Well, I think there was certainly a lot of sympathy. It was a big event when my father died in that town. He was only 48. And so people were aware of the tragedy and, would express that to me. And then, when I went back to school, I guess after taking 2 weeks off or whatever you do for the funeral and the burial, my teachers kind of gave me a ride for a quarter, said, even though I wasn't working, still gave me passing grades. But by the end of the year, I was just failing everything.
So you're a junior in high school at that point.
Exactly. I was a junior in high school. And by the end of my junior year, I was drinking quite a bit, I think. And early into my senior year, I started smoking marijuana. And I was really one of the few people doing that. I mean, this was 1966. So, my guidance counselor called me a hippie, and I had never heard that word before. That's how long ago that was.
And the war was going on at that point, too.
The war was going on, and I was ripe for the draft. I did get a deferral. When I had those panic attacks after my drug use, my psychiatrist, he wrote a note, and he said I was suffering from spells of disorientation. And I guess for the military to think that I could be there in the jungle with a rifle and not get disoriented about who I was supposed to shoot at, they gave me a deferment. That was one of the greatest days of my life when I got that deferment.
Must have been a lot of fear that you would end up in the Army, huh?
There was tremendous fear that I would end up in the Army, yeah. And also, I don't think I wanted to leave my family. And, we were just kind of clinging on to each other, after what happened.
So what happens after high school? What was the trajectory at that point?
It's kind of an interesting story. In 1971, I had a friend who had been to Europe a few times, and he convinced me to take a trip to Europe with him and another buddy. And my sister was a stewardess on Pan Am. So I got a family discount ticket and I went to Europe. And man, that trip, it was the first time I felt that weight of the grief leave me. The old world became my new world. And I just loved it. And I think that has a lot to do with why I'm still here, why I moved here eventually.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Amsterdam and Brussels and Paris and Rome. I spent a lot of time in Rome, did a bit part in a Fellini movie even. But I knew I wanted to be a musician. And I came back to America, went to San Francisco, and then I would play a lot of the open mic clubs there where you didn't get paid, but you could drink as much as you wanted to. And which I would do. After one of those nights, the next morning, the girl I was living with, I woke up and she said, "Elliot, you're yellow." And I thought I just had a really bad hangover. And I finally went to the hospital and they said I was jaundiced. I had caused by alcohol. It was alcohol. It wasn't the hepatitis, the serious one, but I did have a liver hepatitis and I had to go back.
Hepatitis C, was that the one that you had?
I guess that's the one, if that's the least serious. But I was so sick, and I went back to New York to get better, at which I did. And my doctor told me, listen, you cannot drink for a year or take any drugs because your liver couldn't handle it. In fact, another girl who I think also got the same hepatitis as I had in San Francisco, she was in the hospital with it and got bored and took some pills and died because her liver couldn't handle it. So the amazing thing, Howard, was in that year of not drinking, I got a band together. I started playing in New York. I started knocking on doors of record companies. I got a record contract. I recorded my first album. It came out, and boom, my picture was in Rolling Stone and Newsweek magazine. I mean, my dreams had come true.
While you were not drinking?
Yeah, not drinking for this year.
Did you ever put the two together?
Not at that time. No, not at all. In fact, I was a little ashamed of it because, all my heroes were drinking and taking drugs. I wanted to be a Rolling Stone, I wanted.
Was that fear for your liver then? Was it the medical diagnosis that scared you out of doing anything for that year in which so many good things happened to you?
First of all, I don't think my alcoholism had gotten to the point where I couldn't stop. I was able to control it like that, first thing.
Uh-huh.
I think I was pretty scared because I was so sick. It was the sickest I'd ever been in my life. And then, like I've said, I had this love for the music and I was motivated and I was writing songs and I was writing songs about my story kind of with my family. I think that's why that first album, it got so much attention because it was almost like sharing,
It was kind of cathartic too, I'll bet.
It was very cathartic. But then once that year was up, kind of, there wasn't like a day that I began, but then I started pretty much drinking again. And I did a lot of interviews in those early days.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them were over lunch. And I found if I drank a few scotches before started talking, I thought my interviews were more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So I would start drinking at lunch, those interviews. Then I started going on the road and touring. And I found, if I had a bottle of Jack Daniels in the dressing room, that would help things too, loosen me up on stage.
What was your thinking there, Elliot, when you started drinking again after that year of not, because of what your doctor said and because of having the jaundice and being so sick? What thoughts went through your mind before you took that drink or the first few drinks that let it be okay that you were drinking? I mean, what were you telling yourself about your liver that allowed you to take those drinks?
That's an interesting question because I was sharing at a meeting the other night, and the guy who was sharing was talking about how he was into fashion and he had gotten his dream job and moved to New York City and then blew everything. And in my 39 years, I think I've heard more stories of people who couldn't handle success, and that fueled their drinking, and that fueled their drug abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And I think at the point where I started getting successful and I could drink again, I was so nervous about it and so anxious about it. And so who was I supposed to be? You know, they were calling me the new Bob Dylan. Who was I supposed to be?
Mm-hmm.
So I think the two kind of dovetailed into each other. And I just found that alcohol kind of helped me know who I thought I was supposed to be. And at that time, I got involved in some very high-powered management company. They were managing Aerosmith and a lot of other great acts. And I remember them saying to me, Elliott, just don't do two things. Don't get divorced, because then you have to give your wife everything you got, and don't get into cocaine. And of course, I did both those things,
Did
Howard.
they know that you had the liver issue?
No, no, not really.
Did you have anybody at that time who you had to be accountable to, or you felt like you needed to be accountable to?
Very interesting question. I did not. I really lacked a father figure in every way.
Yeah.
And my mother was just not really capable. And things were happening for me. So, who's going to tell me I'm doing it wrong at that time, you know?
So you're a young guy who had all these problems with his liver. You're healthy again. It's okay to drink. You're having all this success. How about what you were being told by the people around you? What I've interviewed quite a number of musicians for the podcast over the 150 interviews I've done, and one of the questions I always like to ask is about the enabling that goes on around the people who are handling the musician, or the people who are going on the road with them, or the people at the record companies or whatever, doing all the enabling that makes it particularly difficult to stop, especially if those people are addicted and have alcoholism too.
Well, I would have to say, honestly, I can't really put the blame on the music business. I don't think anyone who was in a responsible position, either at a record company or management, encouraged me to drink or to take drugs, honestly. I think I gravitated toward the people who would want to get high with me. And then my road, which always led toward the music, it kind of started diverting toward let's get high.
Hmm.
And the music enabled me to do that because of my career and the money I was making and everything else. But I can't really blame it on the music. But in fact, if anything, I think I needed to make amends to the music business because I had such tremendous opportunities and I wasn't responsible with them. I remember once when I signed to Columbia Records, they held a luncheon for me at 21, which is this very famous upscale restaurant in New York City. And I'd been up doing coke until an hour before I got to that lunch. When I got to that lunch, I was just a basket case. And when I had to make a speech, I don't know what I babbled out. And I just looked at these guys' faces. They're thinking, we're investing $1 million
Mm-hmm.
in this guy. So I didn't get too much enabling. I mean, let's face it, in rock and roll, it's sex and drugs and rock and roll. So no one was telling me not to drink or not to take drugs, and there's so many examples of successful artists, drinking and drugging. There are many more examples. I think they're not as well known of those who fell by the wayside because of their addictions and alcoholism.
Did you feel like the drug usage, either the marijuana or the cocaine or anything else that you were doing, was actually sharpening up your songwriting and your singing?
Not at all.
Really?
I don't think I ever wrote songs drunk or high. I don't think I ever hardly performed high. I might take one drink, a shot of Jack Daniels, but I never went on stage drunk. I never did coke during a show until the end days when things were really bad.
Why not? You're able to do everything else drunk and stoned. Why not perform?
I think because I respected the music that much.
Mm-hmm.
I knew when it was good and when it was bad. I knew when I was playing good and not playing well, and I knew when I was writing a song. And honestly, those early albums I did, and I've made over 40 albums, but
Mm-hmm.
those early albums have really withstood the test of time, and I think it's because of that. I think it's because of that.
So somewhere along the way, you drew the connection between the use of alcohol and drugs and its effect on you as a professional musician and songwriter.
I did not make that connection until I went to my first AA meeting. And that was a eureka moment.
Yeah.
That was like, whoa, alcohol. This is it. If I don't drink, I'm going to be okay, they're telling me. And, I have a very big ego.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully sobriety has deflated it a little bit. But when I arrived at that first AA meeting, where I was in life, I was so disappointed where I was. I mean, sometimes I'd be driving a truck for $100 to move some band's equipment because I'd be so broke. And I was so disappointed that I had lost all faith in my own decision-making ability. So I was really ready. I had been humbled, really humbled at that point.
Yeah.
And I was ready to take all the suggestions, all the advice. I was ready to go all in into AA.
Can you take a second and talk to me about the slide from being very successful during that period of time till you ended up in AA? Obviously, it's not an overnight happening, but when did that success and everything you were enjoying go south on you and you started to go into that slide? What was that like and how long did it take?
I think it took about 10 years, I guess,
Yeah.
about 10 years. I mean, my drinking and drugging career was about 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
I think from the time I was 25 till I was 35. I got sober at 35. I felt when I lost interest in touring, I would stop tours. I'd make some excuse, but I think I just really wanted to be at home getting high. I don't think it affected my chops as a musician, but it really affected my decision-making ability. I made so many bad decisions. I had so many resentments against people. I would quit things and fire people and drop the ball, halfway through. Almost all of my early albums, I did something to sabotage them. I believe this is a self-destructive disease and it manifests itself in so many ways. And that's how it manifested itself in my career. I had no patience. I wanted immediate gratification. I was not willing to put in the time necessary, to get to the Bruce Springsteen level.
Did you have anybody in your life at that time, Elliott, who pulled you aside, noticing your behavior, noticing the decline, say anything to you about it, or were you impervious to what people were talking about?
I think I was impervious, but I think I was one point, I remember I was out on the end of Long Island and my sister was there and she said to me, God, I never saw anyone drink so much so quickly as you. But I was almost proud of it. My heroes were all alcoholics. F. Scott Fitzgerald, he was my main man as a writer. So, I didn't see what the problem was. I was running on fumes, but I didn't know it.
And your liver, how was your liver doing through all this?
My liver seemed to have recovered. I've never had any problems with my liver through those years. But, I was very susceptible to the effects of alcohol and drugs, very susceptible. It didn't take much to have its effect on me. They say Jim Morrison was that way. The Doors, he'd have one drink and he just turned into a different person. I felt it was always that way with me.
So your attitude changed when you were drinking, didn't it?
My attitude changed a lot. I thought I was king of the universe and I knew it all.
How did that play out amongst the people you were around?
Well, as long as I was on top and paying salaries and doing things like that and making money for everybody, that played out pretty well.
Yeah.
But when the mighty have fallen, you're alone.
We'll be right back. My friends, if you're enjoying AA recovery interviews, I invite you to check out my latest audiobook, Alcoholics Anonymous, the story of how more than 100 men have recovered from alcoholism. This is the word-for-word, cover-to-cover reading of the first edition of the Big Book, published in 1939. It's a relaxing yet meaningful and engaging way to listen to the Big Book anytime, any place. Have a free listen at Audible, iTunes, or Amazon. While you're there, search for my other audiobook, Lost Stories of the Big Book, 30 original stories from the first and or second editions missing from the third and fourth editions of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's also available from Amazon as a Kindle book or in paperback if you'd like to read along. You're going to love it. And we're back. When did the decline start to get severe for you in the years before you hit AA? Was it gradual all the way up to the end, or was there a point at which you had a tendency to just drop off?
Well, I did a tour of Japan in 79, I think, and then I came back to New York. And for some reason, I decided I had to fire my management and I had to do this on my own, and I could do that. And very quickly after that, yeah, I went from in the early days of my career, living in the Beverly Hills Hotel for months at a time to living on a cot in my mother's kitchen.
Hmm.
And that was the point. So I went into kind of, between 80 and 85, the last 5 years of my drinking, I was kind of in limbo, I would still had a public in Europe that I could go to.
Sure.
And I would tour over here through a few times a year, play some shows over here. And I was kind of kept myself in good shape for those shows. I don't know how I did it, but those last 5 years was a serious decline. Nobody was interested in me in the music business. I mean, I couldn't get arrested.
For 5 years.
Yeah.
Talk to me about being a functional alcoholic and how that might have helped or hindered you in life and in your career.
I think it hindered me because I did not hit that physical bottom, which a lot of people talk about. I definitely hit the spiritual bottom hard,
Mm-hmm.
and the mental bottom. When I would be up for a few days binging on Coke and alcohol, I got really psychotic. I mean, hearing voices outside my door,
Mm-hmm.
rolling along on the carpet, thinking someone's out there. I mean, this is really, it's like, this is why that second step is so important to me, because I really believe I was insane
Yeah.
when I came in here. But I didn't have that physical bottom. So, I'd go on these binges, and then I'd recover. And, I guess I looked almost normal to people.
Yeah.
And until the next time, that's how I was a functioning alcoholic. I could maintain, I could drink every day, and it didn't seem to, I didn't land in the hospital.
Sometimes being a functional alcoholic is the greatest hindrance to getting sober. I can stop when I want, even though I'm stopping between binges. So that must prove that I don't have the problem that I need, that I ultimately find out I need AA for.
You're so right. I mean, I did not think I had a problem with alcohol, really. And I remember at one of my early meetings in Milwaukee, this old timer woman came up to me and she said, I had just shared or told my story. She said, you're lucky you got into that cocaine. I said, why is that? She said, because from what I hear of you, your alcoholism might not have caught up with you for another 10 years or so. But that cocaine really greased your slide. That was how she put it. Greased my ride to the bottom. Yeah.
Mm. I've heard that from so many people, and some of the professionals that I know who deal with drug addicts and alcoholics all the time say that the drugs take people down so much more quickly, which is why you see so many young people in the CA and NA programs and not as many in AA. And I think, from my observation, that seems to be true. So the cocaine was taking you down pretty quickly.
It was. And here in Paris, although there is NA, especially French NA, and there is CA, but the AA is really the epicenter of recovery here. So, and it's almost all mixed, because of a certain generation, most of the time drugs are a part of your story as well. That's what happened when you drank. You did drugs.
That's what it was like for me too. It was the same thing. And early on in the program, I've been sober 36 and a half years now, and early on in the program, I would say, my name is Howard, and I'm a drug addict and alcoholic. And somewhere along the way, in my first couple of years, somebody said, well, when I came into AA, it dragged all of my other addictions in with me. So to say that I'm an alcoholic covers it all. But I understand people needing to say drug addict and alcoholic, the ANDAs.
Well, I couldn't agree more because, as I always say, I've never met two people who do this program the same. We all do it differently. The one common point we have is usually going to meetings. That's something everybody does.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the magic happens. But everything else, I mean, I've known people who never open the big book and people who read the big book every day, people who do the steps once a year and people who have never done the steps, But Seems to me if you keep going to meetings, you will get it in a way that works for you. And that's what my situation was early. But I agree with you. I think alcoholic has almost just become a generic term
Yeah, it has.
for whatever this disease is.
So you've talked about getting sober, going to your first AA meeting, staying sober from that point until today, 39 years later. What were the first days, weeks, months like for you in AA? And did you ever consider not continuing at any point, or were you getting more and more hooked the longer you stayed?
Well, to get back to Rita in Milwaukee, we were romantically involved. So we got involved before because I didn't go to meeting the day after. It was a couple of weeks after I met her.
Uh-huh.
I could say, they say no romantic entanglements the first year. I could say that's true because we were involved before
Yeah.
I went to AA. So there was that, and that was keeping me in too, because that was
It's enough.
it's enough. And I don't know why it was easy for me, Howard. I don't know why my desire to drink left me. I drank every day, and I didn't think I was an alcoholic.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't think cocaine was a hard drug. Mocus was the word we used to use in New York. That's how out of it I was. It just left me that desire, thank God. And I'll tell you, it certainly hasn't been all the way from my other defects of character or shortcomings.
No, I get that. I get that. But one of the things I'm curious about. 16, you're standing bedside by your dad, or you're in the same house, and you're kneeling down and asking God for something that he didn't deliver at that point for you. What occurred for you during your first number of months within AA to establish a spiritual connection, or did you not have one immediately?
I think I was on a bit of a pink cloud,
Mm-hmm.
first of all. I started feeling better physically right away, had more energy. My Rita was a personal trainer,
Hmm.
so I was going to the gym and staying in shape, and so that changed right away. What was my connection with a higher power? Well, I think I just kind of took it on faith. I wasn't for a very short time. I went back to the church of my childhood, which was the Episcopal Church,
Mm-hmm.
and went in there, and I thought I was going to reconnect that way, but I didn't feel it.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I just felt the power, I guess, in the rooms.
Yeah.
That was really my higher power at that point.
So you weren't resistant to the idea of God as a result of what you had experienced earlier in life? Were you open to it, or just not paying as much attention as some people do?
I don't think I was threatened by it.
Uh-huh.
Some people, they're very threatened by that God aspect of AA and the religious aspect, but I just always thought you could take what you want and leave the rest as long as you didn't pick up a drink a day at a time. So I didn't feel threatened by it. I had never had a really bad religious upbringing, as some people have. And I'm in New York, that runs the gamut, from people, pure atheists to people who will go back to church.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so I never felt threatened by the God issue in AA. I still don't. And I always say if I had a faith meter, which shows how strong my faith is. When things are going my way, my faith meter is very strong. When life does not give me what I want, my faith meter goes down very quickly.
Yeah. I noticed something similar when I was, and since I've been sober over the years, that my feeling in the beginning was everything that was going right in my life was God working in my life. Everything that went wrong was something else, like God wasn't involved in any of that. But I've since come to learn that He's involved in the good and the bad and everything else in between. Did you get a sponsor immediately when you first came in, Elliott? Or tell me about your sponsor and sponsorship.
Yes, I did get a sponsor in the first year. When I went back to New York to get sober,
Mm-hmm.
really, because I was living there, and someone in Milwaukee AA said to me, "We've had you New Yorkers here. You all seem to have careers and therapists." And she said, "Out here, we have jobs and sponsors." So I went back to New York, and I did get a sponsor. I was at a meeting right next to where I lived,
Mm-hmm.
and this guy was speaking, and he was a musician,
Hmm.
piano player, and he was talking about doing cocaine, and he was talking about groupies, and he was the same lifestyle. And I said, oh, fantastic. And I asked him to be my sponsor. Turned out he was a classical pianist.
Hmm.
He was not a rocker at all.
Oh boy.
And we're still in touch to this day. I did the steps with him. He was a very laissez-faire kind of sponsor, which is what I needed. I didn't need someone telling me you got to do this, you got to do that. I don't work well with authority.
Yeah.
He was just right for me. Rita and I got married.
Mm-hmm.
We had a long distance relationship first when she was in Milwaukee, I was in New York. We couldn't figure out why our higher power was keeping us apart until we got together.
Mm.
Then it became obvious. 2 years, the marriage was over.
No.
And I had 5 years of sobriety at that time. And a good friend of mine, another musician in the program, said, well, what do you want to do now? Because you can do things. And I said, I really want to move to Paris. And he said, well, I think I know someone who has an apartment there. And it was just magical, like boom, boom, boom. Within 2 weeks, I was putting my key in the door of an apartment that I sublet for 6 months in Paris.
Huh.
So I moved to Paris, and I pretty quickly got a sponsor there. And he was a guy named Ted.
Mm-hmm.
He was Canadian. He passed away with 50 some years of sobriety. He was really his sponsor, a guy named Zebra, had taken Epi to his first Oxford group meeting. So I was really connected to the pioneers there. And Ted was a funny guy, and I liked him. He was smart, sophisticated, but he always used to give me the same advice, which was, Elliott, don't fuck it up. That was his basic sponsorship mantra to me. He passed away 10 years ago or so, and he had dementia, did hardly recognize me at the end. In Switzerland, I used to go visit him.
Mm-hmm.
And now I have a good friend named Ed, also Canadian, who lives in London, and we almost do this co-sponsor thing with each other. And I don't know if that's kosher or not, but it seems to be working for us.
Absolutely. When we get close enough to our sponsors that it becomes a co-sponsoring situation. That's how it is with my sponsor. I've had the same sponsor for my entire length of my sobriety, and it's meant a lot. He hasn't lived in Houston in the last 30 years, and he's moved all over the country, different places, but he's always either on a plane or in a hotel room, and I probably talk to him more often than people whose sponsors are right there in town. Sponsorship is so important, and that relationship building that I never really knew how to do when I was younger really got boosted by having a good sponsor.
Yeah.
And how about you sponsoring other men? What's your experience been there?
I have sponsored quite a few.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, I don't think I'm a very good sponsor.
Why?
I don't know why. Maybe I'm just too self-absorbed. But I do have a sponsee now, a great guy named Liddell,
Uh-huh.
and he's a true blues man from the south side of Chicago who lives in Paris. He's a very interesting story because AA literally saved his life because 2 years ago, he had a heart attack in an AA meeting.
Oh, wow.
And he was surrounded by enough people who knew what they were doing, who got an ambulance there and took care of him. And if he had had that heart attack anywhere else, so he always likes to say, AA really saved my life. So maybe I'm being too hard on myself because Liddell, my sponsee, we've stayed together quite a long time. I'm not a tough sponsor. I've had a lot of people ask me to sponsor them, and I say, okay, call me. But I never say, you got to call me every morning at 10 o'clock in the morning and, you got to read the big book. Because I think if people want it, they get it. And if they don't, there's not much you can say.
So my guess is that you're a service guy in other ways. Talk to me about your involvement with your groups and AA in general.
I've done all kinds of service. I mean, I've done everything from doing the coffee to chairing meetings. During Zoom, I started a meeting, which is still going on. It's called 1 Minute at a Time, because my theory is, Howard, this may sound cynical, but the longer the shares, the less the gratitude.
Yeah.
So I started this meeting called 1 Minute at a Time, where everyone shares for 1 minute. That's all.
Oh, wow.
And the opening share is just 5 minutes, and it's a play on words from a day at a time, a minute at a time. And it's kept going now for years. And we've had a couple of people who got sober during the COVID pandemic in that meeting. And we get a lot of old timers in this meeting. And The meeting's over when everyone shares. We go through every person.
So the meeting could be 20 minutes long if you've got 20 people in the room.
Exactly. Well,
Or
the
25
opening
minutes,
share is
yeah.
5 minutes, 25 minutes, but
Whoa.
sometimes it ends at 40 minutes. Sometimes it's over an hour. And, I think I was just like in a state of grace when I got this concept. I hope it goes to other places.
They say anything more than a couple minutes is ego.
That's it.
We also have a tendency to go to a lot of the on and on and on meetings, and so that's entirely too much. So you've started meetings, you've been of service to your group. One of the things that I've noticed being sober a long time is that people see the number of years and they think that everything is easy as a result, and that he's sober for so long he must not have any problems. And I always like to debunk that by telling my truth in whatever meetings I'm going to. But sometimes it's difficult knowing that the number of years can actually be a barrier to some of the younger people and some of the more newly sober, that they can see somebody with 35 or 40 years sober and think, there's no way in the world I could ever get there. And plus, that guy's got all those years. His life must be perfect. What do you say to people like that?
Well, I say, 39 years is a lot of sobriety, but it's just a lot of life, really. I'm a big believer that sobriety and AA is a bridge back to life.
Yeah.
I either read or someone else told me, you've really achieved perfect spirituality when you are grateful for everything that happens to you in life, the bad and the good. Now, I'm certainly nowhere near that level, but as you know, Howard, life has got its own agenda, and I've had great success. I've had terrible failures. I've had joy. I've had depression. I've had fear and anxiety. I've had courage. All this part of the human experience. I would look when I was first came in, if I saw someone with 39 years, I just thought they were Buddha, sitting on top of the mountain. And
Yeah. One of the things I like to ask, if you, Elliott, at 39 years sober, knowing what you know now, could go back and talk to an earlier version of yourself about life or about getting or staying sober, about what to do next, which Elliott would that be? How old would they be, and what would you be talking to them about?
I think I would like to talk to the 16-year-old Elliott who was, standing there, just lost his father, family going into free fall, and just, drowning in grief, and just tell him, this will pass. Everything in life passes. You will recover. Have some patience, just stay true to yourself. Because I know I had no patience for anything back then. And when they used to wish me a slow recovery, did everyone ever say that to you?
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
sure as well. Really pissed me off. I wanted to do these 12 steps in 12 days. And, I always thought that you got high after the fourth step in some way. That's why I wanted to do that so badly. But now I understand, slow recovery. The days of instant gratification are over. And, as my sponsor, Ted, used to tell me, don't fuck it up. And one of the ways you can certainly do that is by moving too fast, not sitting back and waiting for kind of life to show you the way.
Yeah. It's a beautiful way to think about it, too. That God has an agenda somewhere that we don't necessarily know about. Ours is just the job of staying available for it and staying open-minded to it. And you sound like your sobriety is a comfortable place to be.
I compare it to like being on a ship, and I'm the only passenger, and the ship is on this river or sea, and sometimes, the waves are crashing over the side, and sometimes it's calm. But I know this ship is unsinkable. And as long as I stay on that boat and I don't get off it, I'll be okay.
So if you went up to the wheelhouse, you'd open the door and there'd be a bunch of people from your meeting standing there?
I think if I went up to the wheelhouse, the door would be locked. They wouldn't let me in. Because I'm a passenger. I'm not the pilot. I'm not the pilot. I never would have imagined when I moved here to Paris, 5 years of sobriety, I met a woman who I had met on the road 6 years before. We had no contact in those 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
We got married. We're still together.
That's great.
Uh, we have a son who is 33,
Wow.
who's gonna have 10 years of sobriety soon. You know, when you see people with a drinking problem and you tell them, well, come to AA, you'll get better. But if they don't, I'm not going to go out there. But when you see that fatal disease in the person you care about more than anyone else in this world, almost,
Yeah.
and you have to tell him, if you go to AA, you'll get better. That is really the test of how much you believe in this program. Do you really believe it works? And I think that was the point where I really did believe it works.
Yeah, and you have to follow your own path. Makes me wonder when I know and I know so many people, as I'm sure you do, who are sober a really long time, who have children who have time in sobriety, but who were obviously alcoholics out there at one point, to want to tell them exactly what to expect when I don't know what's next in their life, and they've got to have their own relationship with a higher power. But what I hear people say is that sometimes the kids of recovering alcoholics get involved with alcohol to prove that they are not like the parent who needed AA to stay sober. And it's really difficult, I think, for people, especially nowadays with some of the drugs that are going around, to deal with it as well. What's been your experience?
I brought my son to some meetings when he was quite little because I would be babysitting and I want to go to a meeting. My wife would be working or something, and
Yeah.
he would come to those meetings. And I once asked him after he had gotten sober, I said, "What did you think of AA and those when he came in there?" And he said, "Well," he said, "I thought there was an AA SWAT team that if you picked up a drink, they were going to burst through the windows in black, dressed in black like ninja fighters." But when I told him he should, first I gave him all the classic suggestions. I said, well, see if you can just drink beer and wine, try not to drink for 90 days, set a limit on how much you're going to see how that works out. And of course, none of that worked out because the last thing I wanted to do, Howard, was make it seem like this is parental punishment.
Oh, yeah.
Didn't want it to go down that road. So all I did when he finally came in he had a bad night, a really bad night. And he came in just down. We lived in the same building here.
Mm-hmm.
And he came up to see me. And I said, well, first you should get some sleep. And then tomorrow you should go to this meeting. That would be my suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to go with you. Mm. You should go to this meeting. And he did. And he got a sponsor at the first meeting, still his sponsor. And sometimes I think he has a better program than me. You know what they say? It's the second mouse who gets the cheese.
Isn't that true? Well, that's wonderful. And in fact, I guess if you were counting the blessings of sobriety, he might be on the top of that list, huh?
Oh, of course, yeah. Everything I have. I mean, I have a pretty wonderful life here in Paris, and every once in a while, I realize it.
It's nice to take a minute to say thank you, God, at those moments when we have those realizations. I have them as well, but I never know when they're going to occur. One thing I know for sure is that if I go to an AA meeting, I will absolutely feel better coming out than going in, no matter how I'm feeling that day.
We all say that, and it's so true.
It's so true. And it's nice to talk to other members of the choir, so to speak, but you're an amazing man. I'm so glad that I had the opportunity to get to talk with you today and hear your story. We just met, and yet I feel like, man, we've been brothers forever, because I think there's a common thread that runs through AA that links us all together in a spiritual way that nothing else does. And I appreciate you sharing and trusting me with your story, because I know sometimes the questions aren't easy, and it's a little bit different than just getting up and telling your story. You sound like you work a great program.
I think after all my years of sobriety,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it hardly matters what we say in these meetings. I think we're all connecting on a spiritual level that is similar to, I like to compare it to when a dog watches television.
Yeah.
I know he knows something's going on there. That's the same way I feel about AA. I know something's going on here. I'm not sure if I understand it all.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, and I'm in for the ride.
Yeah, I am too. And I want to thank you again for doing this interview today, Elliott. And you're a heck of a guy, and I'm glad I know you now.
Thank you, Howard, and kudos to you too for doing these wonderful podcasts. This is the future. Look how Zoom got us through the COVID pandemic with AA. And now these podcasts, such as you're doing, are wonderful. And I think the next thing that's going to happen is artificial intelligence, where you're going to be able to wake up each morning, punch something in on a computer, and it's going to tell you what your life would have been like if you didn't get sober. Probably will just show you a gravestone.
That's a great idea for a new app there, Elliott.
There we go.
Where you would have been without AA and sobriety.
There
Isn't that
you
wonderful?
would have been without AA.
Yeah. Well, thanks again.
Thank you, Howard, my friend. See you down the road.
Thank you. God bless.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Well, my friends, that's it for today's episode of AA Recovery Interviews. I want to thank my guest, Elliott M., for sharing his story, and thank you for tuning in. If you've enjoyed the interviews in this podcast series, will you please share it with others? This show is another helping hand of AA we can all extend to alcoholics everywhere. If you want to contact me directly with any comments, questions, or suggestions, simply email howard@aarecoveryinterviews.com. Please also take a minute to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. And take note, AA Recovery Interviews can now be found on the YouTube Music app. By the way, this podcast strictly adheres to AA's 12 traditions and all General Service Office guidelines for safeguarding anonymity online. I pay all production costs. AA Recovery Interviews and my guests do not speak for or represent AA at large. This podcast is simply my way of giving back to AA that which has been so freely given to me. The next episode of AA Recovery Interviews is on the way, so keep coming back. It'll be here soon.